Thank you very much. You know, many of you love sweet and sour food. You go with Chinese restaurants, sweet and sour pork, sweet and sour this. I tend to like sour, not sweet. But America likes sweet and sour. So today's show on the Michael Savage podcast is a sour and sweet show. We begin with the sour, meaning the news, the horrible news of the day. War is terrible. War is painful. We begin with is Putin playing Possum, and other news stories such as Russia could win World War III in Europe with the EMP nuclear attack, according to one of the world's great experts, Peter Pry. And then we go into the general meat of the dish for today, which is my birthday extravaganza. Birthday extravaganza, because this week my birthday is on the 31st. So we put together some great pieces from the past that you're going to love. A birthday wish from Graham Hancock from 2007. My broadcast from 9/11/01. Many people requested that. Shadows on the Wall talking about politics and Plato, 2006. My discussion of Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger from 2009. Yours truly answering calls as Senator Bernie Sanders. Definition of a red diaper doper baby from 2007. Mama Savage on longevity, and The Meanest Mothers You Knew from a show years ago on radio. But we're going to begin first with, I guess, the sour before we go to those sweet pieces. And the first piece is going to be, is Putin playing Possum? You listen to that and tell me what you think. Because the news, as you know, is distorted. It's all one way, and I don't trust the news. If you trust the people who lied to you about COVID, and now you believe everything they're saying to you about the war between Russia and Ukraine, I pity you. We'll talk about the Battle of Austerlitz, Dr. Pry, who he is, the torture of Russian troops, and other things, and then we'll go to the sweet stuff right here on the Michael Savage Podcast. Welcome to the Michael Savage Podcast. This is a special edition. Why do I say special edition? Everyone says special edition. I received an email over the last few days from a friend of mine who's a physicist who works in very interesting areas, in some cases with the Defense Department. I don't really know exactly his connections, but I've known him for many years. His name is Dr. Jack Sarfati, and he quotes a Dr. Pry, who I looked into, who's very interesting, and I'll tell you more about him later. But the important thing is not who sent this to me, but the idea itself. And today's podcast is called, Is Putin Playing Possum? And according to the piece I got, I'm just going to read it to you. It says, Dr. Price says U.S. military intelligence, the White House, the CIA, and others are in a dysfunctional state of optimistic denial, while Putin and his men are in a dysfunctional state of paranoia armed with modern tactical nukes. 2,000 to 8,000 against NATO's 200. Let me say that again. According to this article or this email, Putin has 2,000 to 8,000 nukes. NATO has 200. And the article, which is very alarming, goes on to say Putin will use nukes on the battlefield. People say, well, wait a minute, wouldn't the radiation blow onto Russia? This email says his nukes can be tuned to localized small explosions with little radioactive fallout. Then he goes on to say NATO has very few mainline battle tanks. Putin has 20,000. Let me repeat that. You haven't seen many tanks thus far. You've seen tanks and trucks blown up, Russian tanks and trucks blown up, and you've been cheering, even though it's the death of other human beings. It doesn't matter to most people. They want to see Russians dead. Putin has 20,000 tanks, which this email says he's holding in reserve. What he put out were old line tanks as sacrifices. And it goes on. It says Putin is using Napoleon's Austerlitz strategy in Ukraine by baiting NATO to enter Ukraine. Note that Putin has not deployed his new tanks. He is deliberately sacrificing old tanks in Ukraine to make senile Biden and our woke JCS Secretary of Defense think he is losing. I don't even know what JCS means. Ukraine has only 70 fighter planes. Putin is holding back his real Air Force. Now, let's pause on that. We've all been asking, where's Putin's Air Force? The idiots in the media said Putin's Air Force is not functional. Remember that idiocy? I thought he was holding back his real air force because had he wanted to, he could have devastated Ukraine in the first 24 hours. This goes on alarmingly, says Putin has 1 million soldiers and only sent 175,000 into Ukraine. It says Putin is using Ukraine as a testing ground like Hitler did in the Spanish Civil War. Putin is deliberately battle-hardening his troops in Ukraine and is intentionally giving our guys the impression the Russian army is screwing up on logistics. He says Napoleon played the same trick. Putin knows Biden is stupid and will take his bait. It goes on, and I'm quoting now. Putin has ICBMs on his subs, which are not in the Atlantic and Pacific. Let me repeat that. These ICBMs are on his subs, which are not in the Atlantic and Pacific, but in the seas around Russia, which have undersea cables and are in touch directly with Putin's admirals, unlike ours. I don't know where he's getting this information. He then goes on to say we do not have ICBMs on our subs. They cannot reach Moscow. Putin's main weapon is EMP. He can fry all of NATO from a height of 70 kilometers or so. He can fry all of the USA from a height of 300 kilometers. Even North Korea may have 2 orbiting EMP space weapons now threaten the U.S. homeland. These EMP weapons are over 100,000 volts per meter. Our military-hardened devices are only to 50,000 volts per meter. Very nice. God. It goes on alarmingly and says Putin thinks he can win a nuclear war. Putin has deep underground bunkers for his elite, and Moscow subways have powerful blast doors that will enable ordinary people inside them to survive. Obama hollowed out our nuclear force. Most of our weapons are over 30 years old and will not even work, most likely. Putin has a modern nuclear force on a tactical battlefield scale that he will not hesitate to use. He says that America, under the incompetent lunatic left, is now a helpless sitting duck. We are not protected, and Putin knows it. He then concludes by saying, again, understand what Napoleon did at Austerlitz. Putin is following Napoleon's strategy. This is part 1 of this special podcast, Is Putin Playing Possum? On the Michael Savage podcast. It's alarming. I don't know how true it is, but I wouldn't share it with you if I didn't think it was worth your consideration. What you have just heard is only the beginning of today's podcast, Is Putin Playing Possum? It's based upon the work of Dr. Pry, sent to me by a friend of mine, Dr. Jack Sarfati. In the following more complete version on the podcast, you will learn who Dr. Pry is and why he's so important. And you will also learn about the Battle of Austerlitz, which is also very important for this discussion, right here on the Michael Savage podcast. Thanks for listening.
Michael Savage, a host like no other.
So let's begin with this, and that is the fact that there's a thing called the Battle of Austerlitz. And this is from Wikipedia, which is fairly well known. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because it's germane to what is going on in Ukraine right now. The Battle of the Three Emperors was one of the most important engagements of the Napoleonic Wars, which is why we have a picture of Napoleon on today's podcast. It's considered the greatest victory achieved by Napoleon when the army of France defeated a much larger Russian and Austrian army led by Emperor Alexander I and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II. This battle I'm referring to occurred near the town of Austerlitz in the Austrian Empire, modern-day Slavkov in the Czech Republic. And what happened was, after eliminating the Austrian army during the campaign, French forces under Napoleon seized Vienna in November of 1805. The Austrians avoided further conflict until the arrival of the Russians bolstered Allied numbers. Napoleon sent his army north in pursuit of the Allies, but then he did something strange. He ordered his forces to retreat so he could feign or make believe that he had a great weakness. He was desperate to lure the Allies into battle. So Napoleon gave every indication in the days preceding the engagement that the French army was in a pitiful state. He even abandoned the dominant Pratskin Heights near Austerlitz to show he was weak. He deployed the French army below these heights and deliberately weakened his right flank, which enticed the Allies to launch a major assault there in the hopes of rolling up the whole French line. A forced march from Vienna by Marshal Davout and his Third Corps plugged the gap left by Napoleon just in time. Meanwhile, the heavy Allied deployment against the French right flank weakened the Allied center on the Pratzen Heights, which was viciously attacked by the Fourth Corps of Marshal Soult, S-O-U-L-T. So once the Allied center was demolished, the French swept through both enemy flanks and sent the Allies fleeing chaotically, capturing thousands of prisoners in the process. This disaster of the Allies significantly shook the faith of Emperor Francis in the British-led war effort. What happened soon thereafter was France and Austria agreed to an armistice immediately, and the Treaty of Pressburg followed on December 26th. Victory at Austerlitz permitted the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states intended as a buffer zone between France and Central Europe. This confederation rendered the Holy Roman Empire virtually useless, so the latter collapsed in 1806 after Francis abdicated the imperial throne, keeping Francis I of Austria as his only official title. This Battle of Austerlitz was a military strategy of Napoleon, which led to one of his greatest victories that he ever achieved, by the way. And what I'm trying to say is that he gave indications that he was weak. He withdrew troops. It made it look like the French army was falling apart. And this enticed his enemies to launch a major assault, and the enemies were then defeated. What am I getting at here by talking about the Battle of Austerlitz? I'm saying to you that maybe Putin, like Napoleon, is playing Possum. This is the Michael Savage Podcast. Much food for thought. We've talked about, is Putin playing Possum, the Battle of Austerlitz, and now I want to tell you who Dr. Pry is. It's very important you know who he is. He is the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. He's an expert on EMP, electromagnetic pulse weapons. It's a very big story. There's a lot more to Dr. Pry. You can look it up yourself. He's a genius. He still serves on the Congressional EMP Commission. Even though Congress has not looked into this for a long while, Dr. Pry is an expert on a nuclear EMP attack and what could happen to us. And I want you to pay close attention to what I'm about to tell you. Dr. Pry was an intelligence officer with the CIA and was responsible for analyzing Soviet and Russian nuclear strategy, their operational plans, their military doctrine, their threat perceptions, and in developing U.S. paradigms for strategic warning. There's a lot to be thought about here because we're only hearing part of the truth from the media, as you well know. Now, before we leave you today and go into the podcast itself, which this is, of course, the podcast itself, this is the sour part of the podcast, not the sweet part, which is coming up, which is the birthday celebration, the fun stuff. I want to read you something from Dr. Peter Pry that I think you should know about. It was written on February 17th, 2022, and published in the Washington Times, which is entitled, Russia Could Win World War III in Europe with an EMP Nuclear Attack. I think you should pay close attention to this and give it some thought before dismissing it as mere hyperbole. And here is what he wrote. In 1914, a single bullet fired into the chest of Archduke Ferdinand by a Serbian terrorist exploded into World War I. The Austro-Hungarians mobilized their armies to punish Serbia. Russia mobilized armies to defend their Serb little Slavic brother. Then Germany mobilized, then France, then Britain. And by 1918, there were 40 million casualties, with 15 to 22 million dead. I'm trying to tell you something here. What's going on in Ukraine right now between Russia and Ukraine could lead to World War III, but it'll be worse. He goes on. That's my editorial. I'll read from Dr. Pry. He says, now President Biden's ill-conceived efforts to save Ukraine from Russian invasion could spark a much larger conflict, perhaps even nuclear World War III. And of course, the little comedian in Ukraine, who is not a hero of mine, I think he's a disaster for Ukrainians, incidentally. He's a front man for some other forces, which is not defending what Putin has done. But there should be peace discussed right now, and there isn't. So he goes on. He says, Russia's strategic interests in Ukraine in 2022 are far greater than were Russia's Russian strategic interest in Serbia in 1914. Did you hear that? Ukrainian entry into NATO, official or de facto, Russia perceives as an existential threat. Because then NATO missiles, air forces, and armies advanced to eastern Ukraine would be only 300 miles from Moscow within easy striking distance for a surprise attack on the Russians. Ukrainian territory is traversed by Russian petroleum pipelines that are a major source of Moscow's revenue. Ukraine, according to Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, is Russia's Slavic brother and as part of the former Soviet Union belongs in the new Russian Empire. Remember, he's not saying he agrees with that. He is explaining to you how Putin sees it. I'll go on from Dr. Pryke. Ukraine, if annexed by Russia, will enable Moscow to move its missiles, air forces, and armies into western Ukraine and Belarus along the entire eastern border of NATO member Poland, posing a steel spearhead that could knife through NATO to the English Channel as the USSR threatened to do during the Cold War. Russia's strategic interests in Ukraine, a combination of legitimate defensive concerns and illegitimate aggressive designs, he writes, far outweigh NATO's political will or military capability to defend Ukraine. The U.S. Defense Department and RAND war games show that Russia can overrun Ukraine and the frontline NATO states in Eastern Europe in 72 hours. RAND analysis finds a Russian invasion of NATO's Baltic states cannot be defeated, even if the U.S. resorts to tactical nuclear weapons. Pay attention here. He writes, Russia has an overwhelming advantage in tactical nuclear weapons, an estimated 2,000 to 8,000 warheads, versus 180 tactical U.S. warheads, all of which are based in Europe. You hear that? 2 to 8,000 versus 180. He goes on, and he's an expert. He writes, moreover, Russian nuclear warheads are more technologically advanced, designed for ultra-low yields for use by land, sea, and air forces. Specialized effects like neutrons, X-rays, and electromagnetic pulse, and so-called clean, so they produce no radioactive fallout. He says Russian nuclear weapons are not only a deterrent, but militarily practical for use on the battlefield. Pay close attention. He writes that Biden's strategy to deter Russian invasion by massively arming Ukraine is playing with nuclear fire. Moscow may use Washington's arming of Kiev as a pretext to invade Ukraine and bordering nearby NATO states that are also supplying arms to isolate Ukraine and expand Russia's defensive frontiers, quote-unquote defensive. Biden has sent a few thousand troops to supplement the 8,500 U.S. troops spread out along NATO's eastern border in packets. These are intended to deter invasion of NATO by the 120,000 Russian troops massed on Ukraine's border. First of all, those numbers are not correct anymore. Russian army now numbers over 1 million. He writes, the U.S. military presence is no practical defense of NATO. The U.S. and its NATO allies would be overwhelmed in a conventional war. U.S. forces deployed in Eastern Europe and on Ukraine's border are a tripwire to deter Russia from invading NATO by the threat of nuclear escalation. Yet nuclear escalation is Russia's strategic forte. He writes, Russia could win World War III in Europe with a single super EMP nuclear warhead, detonated 70 kilometers high over NATO headquarters in Brussels. The EMP field would black out electric grids and paralyze NATO military forces from Poland to Britain, making a red carpet for a Russian invasion. U.S. troops and 30,000 civilians fleeing Ukraine would become POWs. Russian tanks could reach the English Channel in days. After an EMP attack, the U.S. would discover it has no tactical nuclear weapons. Even if some delivery systems survive this EMP blast, it is doubtful any host European government would allow a tactical nuclear strike against Russia from its territory, fearing nuclear retaliation. Russia may be able to destroy NATO without World War III, and is already fracturing NATO with the Ukrainian crisis. Germany, European NATO strongman, is being lambasted for refusing to send arms to Ukraine, allegedly because of German dependence on Russian natural gas. However, he writes, maybe Berlin fears stoking war in Ukraine because during the last century, Berlin was on the losing side of 2 world wars. Maybe Germany remembers its destroyed cities being raped and occupied by Russia, remembers its 5 to 7 million dead. NATO has never been more fragile militarily and psychologically. The closer NATO moves toward a losing war with Russia, the alliance will increasingly fracture toward disintegration. He ends by saying, Biden should end the Ukrainian crisis by promising NATO will not include Ukraine or expand eastward. By the way, that's all that Putin asked from the beginning. He should try making Russia a strategic partner or neutral in a new Cold War with China. I don't know how to emphasize that over and over again. All that Biden has done is drive Russia and China together. He says Biden should catch up with Russian nuclear weapon capabilities, which have been decimated, incidentally. He concludes by saying this: the bear, friend or foe, respects only strength. This is by Dr. Peter Pry. He knows what he is talking about. Do you? I'm Michael Savage. Thanks for listening. These are terrible times, and we will soon move on to the sweet part of today's show. I promised you sour and sweet. You just heard the sour. We all need a breather, don't we? Well, here comes the sweetness. Thanks for listening.
The Savage Nation. It's savage.